If it's Tuesday, President Biden delivers his final address to world leaders at the United Nations General Assembly, calling for a diplomatic solution to the crisis in the Middle East as the Israel-Hezbollah conflict escalates. Plus, former President Trump campaigns in battleground Georgia for the first time in nearly 2 months, as his allies on the state's election board pass a controversial new ballot counting rule that could delay results on Election Day. And I'll talk to the Delaware lawmaker who's on track to become the first openly transgender member of Congress about her historic candidacy at a time of deep polarization and conservative culture wars. Hi there and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, and we begin with world leaders gathering in New York, where President Biden delivered his fourth and final address to the UN General Assembly as president, a legacy-defining moment, with new leadership set to take the reins and an election in just 6 weeks. Speaking before world leaders in the UN Hall, President Biden highlighted his decades-long foreign policy record, building partnerships, expanding certain alliances, and rallying Western nations around Ukraine in the face of Russia's unprovoked invasion. But looming over all of it, the ongoing war in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas, and now heightened concerns that the conflict could grow even more than it already has, as Israel and Hezbollah once again exchanged deadly cross-border fire, and as NBC News reports that U.S. officials have limited visibility into whether or not Israel is planning a ground incursion into Lebanon. President Biden today urging de-escalation.
Hezbollah, unprovoked, during the October 7th attack, launching rockets into Israel. Almost a year later, too many on each side of the Israeli-Lebanon border remain displaced. A full-scale war is not in anyone's interest. Even as the situation has escalated, a diplomatic solution is still possible.
But a diplomatic solution, at least for now, appears far off. Israel's military says that over the last 24 hours alone, it dropped some 2,000 munitions on 1,500 Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon and claims to have killed a senior commander in an airstrike on Beirut. The Lebanese health ministry says that since Monday, more than 550 people have been killed in the strikes. Hezbollah also continues to fire into northern Israel. The IDF said it tracked 300 Hezbollah rockets coming over the border, forcing over 1 million Israeli civilians to hide in bomb shelters. The dramatic escalation is raising questions about what could come next, with the Pentagon announcing it will send U.S. troops to the Middle East in case Americans need to flee the region. And NBC News reporting that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government has warned of coming military strikes, but Israeli officials have not told U.S. officials whether or when a ground offensive could begin. That's according to 3 defense officials. Now, amid the growing global tensions, President Biden also spoke about his decision to withdraw from the presidential election, casting it as a lesson for world leaders about politics and power.
I decided after 50 years of public service, it's time for a new generation of leadership to take my nation forward. My fellow leaders, let us never forget, some things are more important than staying in power. It's your people. It's your people that matter the most. Never forget, we are here to serve the people, not the other way around.
Joining me now is our team of reporters. Mike Memoli is in New York, Matt Bradley in Beirut, Courtney Cuby is at the Pentagon, and I'm also joined by NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. So, Mike, let's start with you. Talk to us. How was President Biden's speech received by world leaders? This, of course, his final address to the UN General Assembly.
Well, of course, this is a different kind of room than the president might have been spending his time on most of this fall, obviously, rather than the campaign trail. Speaking to an audience full of fellow world leaders, the kind of audience he's been speaking to as vice president, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for years. I thought it was interesting. One of the first real ovations response from the audience was the laugh from when he began by really addressing the elephant in the room, his longtime service, his age, joking that he was still 40 years old. He knows he looks 40 years old. I thought, though, it was striking, though, the applause lines we did hear. The first real major one had to do with the war in Ukraine, as President Biden framed this as a moment of choice. Are we going to stand by Ukraine against Russian aggression, or will we walk away? I know my choice. And then, notably, invoked the name of his vice president, Kamala Harris, during that part of the speech, the first time he's done so in any of his addresses to the UN over the last 4 years. He also received applause for talking about the actions he's taken to address climate change. I think the real question, though, beyond what we heard in the room, is how much are these world leaders listening to him? What was sort of almost a professorial dissertation about his worldview, his approach to foreign policy, versus how much are they expressing concern and really hedging their bets? We see the vice president, as well as former President Trump, are meeting with some of the world leaders who are also spending time at the UN.
And Mike, today's speech comes at a time of global turmoil. We have wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. Is there any sense that we could see movement on the diplomatic front in either conflict, especially because we are so close to an election?
Well, the president and his team are very fond at this point of quoting George Mitchell, former Senate Majority Leader, longtime diplomat, and saying, you have 1,000 days of failure before 1 day of success. His team, as he has put it, has been tireless in trying to reach a ceasefire agreement, a hostage deal. They are committed to try to do so. Of course, the election calendar here may be influencing Prime Minister Netanyahu, who obviously has looked at a potential return to Donald Trump as something he might favor. And so I think the team believes that there might be an opening after the election, depending on the result, of course. But as we have often seen, a lame duck president in that transition period sometimes has more room to maneuver and more freedom and more receptive audience overseas to get big things done. That's certainly the hope inside the White House.
Okay, Mike Memoli from the UN General Assembly in New York. Mike, thanks for that. Let's go now to Matt Bradley, and we'll turn to you, where there have been more strikes in Beirut overnight. What have you been seeing and hearing on the ground there?
Yeah, well, what we're hearing here in Beirut is a world away from what we're seeing on those images in southern Lebanon. Now, here, we're not really seeing a lot of the violence that we're seeing in southern Lebanon, but there has been 2 strikes in as many days on the southern southern Beirut neighborhoods of Roberi, which was one just today. There was also Dahia yesterday that struck and killed, according to the Israelis, 2 senior Hezbollah officials and several of their top lieutenants. The one today, which struck a 6-story building in Roberi, this killed at least 5 people, according to Lebanese health authorities, and injured many more. So this is consistent with the Israelis' habit of trying to sort of decapitate Hezbollah. And this has been ongoing. You know, a lot of the violence that we're seeing in the south, as you mentioned, has been killing really, we've been talking about how it's the most for the past 20 years, ever since the 2006 war, in a single day. But nearly 500 people, over 500 people were killed yesterday. That really is more probably than we saw back in that 2006 war, where we saw more than double that amount killed in an entire month. And just to put it in context, 500 people killed, that's the amount of people, about the number, that were killed ever since this whole latest conflict started back on October 7th. So this was a major, here in Lebanon, this was a major escalation in just the past 2 days. And it's one that's going to have a searing impact on Hezbollah and their calculations on whether or not they're going to be launching reprisals. They've already been firing projectiles over the border into Israel at a furious pace. But really, remember that this comes a week after so many of their commandos were struck with these pager attacks, these walkie-talkie attacks that maimed hundreds, thousands of them. And this really has set this group in disarray. And this was thought to be one of the most organized paramilitary organizations in the entire Middle East. Now they really are on the back foot. They've been losing their leadership. They've now been losing a lot of their military installations, their rank and file, and a lot of their confidence. And that really is going to have an effect on how they calculate what's going forward. We just heard from Axios reported, and we haven't verified this, saying that Hezbollah has reached out to the Iranians. And this was quoting Israeli officials and American officials, saying that they were reaching out to the Iranians, asking them whether Iran could pitch in and help against Israel. Iran refused. And that's just a metric of the desperation that we're seeing on the part of Hezbollah.
And there's also reports that the IDF claims that it killed a senior commander in Beirut today. Talk to us about who this is and what Hezbollah is saying about it.
Yeah, this is, again, the second such killing in as many days. This is Ibrahim Kobaisi, and this was, according to the IDF, one of the senior commanders of Hezbollah's missile project. They're basically one of the main guys in charge of launching missiles by Hezbollah into Israel. And this is a man, again, according to the IDF, who had been promoted in the past couple of weeks because there have been so many assassinations of top-level Hezbollah officials by the Israelis. So the Israelis had said that this man was responsible for a lot of the projectiles that have been fired into northern Israel. So again, this is consistent with what we've been seeing the Israelis doing time and time again, attacking top leadership to try to kind of decapitate Hezbollah. Obviously, these ranks get filled once again, but this is in the full froth of what is looking increasingly like a new front in this war between Israel and Hezbollah, and it will again have a major impact on Hezbollah's calculations going forward. Ryan.
Okay, Matt Bradley for us in Beirut. Thank you, Matt. Let's go now to Courtney Kuby at the Pentagon. How much was the American military brass aware of Israel's plan to expand its aerial assaults on Lebanon? And what are officials telling you about the possibility that we could see a ground war?
Yeah, so this is one thing that we've been pretty struck by, is how the U.S. has not had a good sense of the specifics of what Israel is really planning to do here. Now, of course, the IDF, as we heard from Matt, and we've been hearing for the past several days, have been somewhat public about their strategic goals here. But beyond those public pronouncements, here in the Pentagon, the U.S. doesn't have a strong sense of exactly what the details are. We heard a little bit about that last week when U.S. officials were saying that, yes, they believe that Israel was behind those pager attacks, but that the U.S. did not have a heads up on exactly what Israel was planning there. So the same exact theme has moved into this potential, or this ongoing fighting back and forth between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel this week. Now, as far as a ground campaign, the IDF have moved some forces north to be ready to prepare for a possible ground offensive, but the U.S. still doesn't have much of a sense of if or when that actually could happen. Again, the Israelis not sharing details about that. The U.S. instead is looking for indicators of a possible ground offensive. So things that they might look for, like a large number of Israeli reservists being called up to active duty, or even something very obvious like columns of Israeli tanks moving north towards the border. At this point, Pentagon and defense officials who we've spoken with have said, look, we're looking for the same kind of indicators that we look for in other cases of military buildups that could indicate a ground offensive. At this point, they are not seeing that, but there is a sense that that sort of a ground buildup could happen relatively quickly in a matter of days or weeks as opposed to months, Ryan.
And we, of course, know about President Biden's relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's been frosty, perhaps tense at times. Is it the same at the military level? What kind of conversations are happening between Secretary Austin and his Israeli counterpart?
Well, they're definitely frequent, and that also extends to the conversations that happen between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs here, General C.Q. Brown, and his counterpart. They talk on the phone quite often. They even meet in person occasionally. So the military-to-military communications are continuing. It's just the fidelity or the level of detail that seems to have changed when you look back to October 7th, when you'll recall there were actually U.S. military leaders, generals, and officials who were on the ground in Israel who seemed to be involved, or at least very aware of the planning process by the Israeli Defense Forces before they moved into Gaza with a ground offensive. That does not seem to be the case here anymore, Ryan. The relationship definitely has been shifting. But I think military officials, especially here in the Pentagon, would say, look, they still have a good communication with the Israelis. It's just not at that same level of detail. I will say that is pretty consistent over years, though. Look to something like Syria. The Israelis have conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria over the years, particularly targeting Hezbollah and forces there in Syria and advanced component parts of weapons that might move through Syria that could ultimately threaten Israel. In the majority of the cases of those strikes, which I will say the Israelis rarely acknowledge to be them, they'll give the U.S. a heads up because there are American forces in the region, but it's very last minute, and they won't give them details about what exactly they're doing, just that they're carrying out some sort of a military mission there. It's an exchange of information that's really more for the safety and security of a force like the U.S. military, Ryan.
Okay, Courtney Kube, thank you for that. We appreciate it. Let's go to Andrea now. And Andrea, you spoke with the vice president of Iran. What did he tell you about this latest escalation and whether Iran could still retaliate?
He did not rule out retaliation. Everyone wants to know whether or not Iran, the major player in this drama, the other shoe that hasn't dropped, is going to retaliate. There have been, from their point of view, a lot of provocations, particularly the assassination of the Hamas political leader in Tehran, in their capital, on the day of the presidential inauguration, their inauguration, this new team coming in. They describe themselves as reformers, not in our context or the rest of the world's, but they are more moderate than their predecessors. They say they want to reach out, they want to give women more rights. And on foreign policy, they say they were looking for a ceasefire, one that has not come about. They see this as a retaliation. They don't blame Hamas, of course, for blocking the ceasefire. They blame everything on Israel. And when I asked him specifically about whether they were going to strike back, here's how that exchange went. Would you rule out retaliating for the attack that killed Hamas's political leader in your capital on the inauguration of your president?
Well, that was clearly an act of state terrorism and a clear violation of our sovereignty and our territorial integrity. We were asked by the international community to exercise restraint in order to bring about an end to the war in Gaza. Unfortunately, that promise has never materialized.
You won't rule out retaliating?
No, we have said that we will respond in a manner of our choosing.
But so far, they have not struck back. They do have huge influence, of course, on their proxies. They deny that they are their proxies. But Hezbollah is their insurance policy there in Lebanon. And Hezbollah so far has not used all of its weapons. That is the big fear, that Hezbollah, with 100,000+ missiles, will strike Israel, and that Israel will go in on the ground. And the big argument right now, as you know, is that Israel is no longer giving the United States, its closest ally, a heads up on its intentions.
Yeah, and well, let's talk about the big picture now. Whoever wins the presidential contest here in November is going to have to deal with these conflicts. How does the next president handle these continued challenges?
I mean, that is the huge problem, and the fact that there are two wars going on, one in Europe, one in the Middle East right now. Either one could expand, could inflame the region, and those are the challenges that leaders here at the United Nations are really facing. That is overshadowing everything else that's happening. There are two camps. The Europeans are, to a large part, worried about Donald Trump. They feel that he will either pressure Ukraine into giving territory back to Vladimir Putin or not be critical enough of Putin. So Eastern Europe feels threatened. All of NATO talks about this at every conference I attend. Of course, the British and the French as well. On the other hand, the Arab world, the Persian Gulf, has always trusted the Trump State Department, Trump negotiators, Donald Trump himself, whom they see as transactional. And so has Netanyahu. And there's a lot of belief in Israel among his critics and elsewhere that Netanyahu has been holding out all along for Donald Trump to be reelected, to get in power and to be able to put more pressure on the Palestinians and oppose a Palestinian state and agree to normalization with Saudi Arabia, which of course is the last part of the Abraham Accords that Donald Trump did start, but that as far as normalization with the Palestinians, that there'll be no future for them under Donald Trump.
A lot to talk about on a very busy day. Andrea Mitchell, thank you as always for bringing us your expertise. And coming up, former President Trump hits the ground in Georgia for his first rally in the key battleground state in nearly 2 months. We're live in Savannah next. Plus, Vice President Harris eyes a campaign stop at the southern border as the Trump campaign ramps up its attacks on the issue of immigration. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. With exactly 6 weeks until Election Day, former President Trump is back in the battleground of Georgia, his first visit to the Peach State since early August. It comes as a New York Times poll shows the former president with a slight lead in Georgia, a state that he narrowly lost in 2020. That lead, of course, is within the poll's margin of error. Speaking in Savannah today, Mr. Trump focused most of his speech on the economy and manufacturing, even as he frequently veered into his favorite topic, immigration.
She's called the tax queen. They love her in other countries because she forces everybody out of our country into their hands. And it's no wonder that under Kamala Harris, we lost 24,000 manufacturing jobs last month. 24,000. We're going to turn that around so fast. The centerpiece of my plan is for a manufacturing renaissance, which will be a 15% made in America tax rate.
Meanwhile, Vice President Harris, who campaigned in Atlanta last week, is using her rival's visit to slam his position on abortion as she barnstorms key battlegrounds later this week. And his sources tell NBC News that Harris is considering a visit to the border when she travels to Arizona on Friday. Joining me now from Savannah is NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, and Aaron Gilchrist has the latest on the Harris campaign from the White House. So, Vaughn, Trump is back in Georgia after several weeks for what was set to be an economy speech. Was that what we heard from the former president today?
We heard some on the economy, and in typical Donald Trump fashion, he veered off in many different tangents. But on the economy front, let's just focus on what he did say, if we could, Ryan. And that was a very aggressive use of the executive branch's potential authorities. And for Donald Trump specifically, that was suggestions that he would, not with Congress's help or backing, but that he would go and impose massive tariffs on imports of goods into the United States. He suggested that, for example, auto manufacturing that comes from Mexico, imports from Mexico, would be tariffed at 100%. He has suggested that he would put a baseline 10% tariff on all of the more than $3 trillion worth of goods coming into the U.S. annually. But for him, just another example, he made the case that he would turn German car manufacturers into American car manufacturers because of the extent to which he would wield the use of tariffs and unilaterally decide to apply them on imported goods. Yesterday, when he was in Pennsylvania, he told some folks that were gathered there that he would put a 200% tariff on the American company John Deere on all manufacturing products that are built overseas and then brought into the United States. And so for Donald Trump, he is making the case that this would all but force American companies or even overseas companies to relocate manufacturing plants here. Of course, the concern among a great many economists is the potential impact that it would have on American taxpayers, because it's American taxpayers who are the ones that ultimately pay for those tariffs on the imported goods. And ultimately, the concern as to whether the U.S. would be able to export its goods, which it relies on economically here in communities across the country. And even Mitch McConnell just this afternoon suggested that he is opposed to these far-reaching tariffs here. But yet Donald Trump is telling communities like this one here in Savannah that that's exactly what he would do to try to increase manufacturing here domestically.
And we know about this ongoing kind of war and maybe just a frenemy relationship that he has with Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp. He seemed to strike a more conciliatory tone with him right now. He's bashed him in the past. Is this a sign of the situation in Georgia and that he needs Kemp's help in order to win?
Right. In 2022, he even ran another Republican against Brian Kemp when he was running for re-election as Georgia governor. Now, that candidate who he endorsed lost to Brian Kemp by almost 50 percentage points, which just goes to show the popularity of the conservative governor here in the state. And Brian Kemp, we didn't see him here at this rally alongside of Donald Trump, but he has openly suggested that he intends to vote for Donald Trump and has even appeared at a fundraiser for his 2024 campaign. Of course, he got the ire of Donald Trump in 2020 when he certified Donald Trump's Georgia loss here, a close loss, which Donald Trump claims falsely that he won the state of Georgia. And really, they've had a tense relationship ever since then. Brian Kemp, we should note, has not closed the door to potentially seeking higher office, whether it be the Senate or even the presidency himself down the road here. But these two are sort of building this symbiotic relationship, and it is very much of a recognition from Donald Trump that if Georgia, as the polls show, is in fact a close race again here in November, that Brian Kemp would only help him, and to try to undercut him is not much of a sell to Georgia voters. And the least that he should do, as he did here this afternoon on stage, is to at least offer some praise, albeit some short-winded praise.
I guess when it comes to Donald Trump, you take what you can get. All right, Vaughn, thank you for that report from Savannah. Let's go now to Aaron. Aaron, the Harris campaign trying to tie Trump to Georgia's 6-week abortion ban during his visit there today. He was there to talk about the economy. Is this how they think they should counter this issue going forward?
Well, this is certainly the strategy that they think is appropriate right now, Ryan. We remember last week we saw this reporting from ProPublica about the 2 Georgia women who died from complications after they were denied treatment. The Harris campaign says that was the result of Georgia's what they call an extreme abortion ban in that state, one that they say Donald Trump is responsible for, one that they say is a part of his legacy. And so today, I think you're seeing the Harris campaign and the Democratic National Committee roll out statements that tie Donald Trump to this abortion ban in Georgia. The DNC also rolled out several billboards across the Savannah metro area, making that same suggestion that these deaths that have happened and potential problems that other women could see as it relates to abortion care or IVF treatment, all those things could be endangered by the actions taken by former President Trump. And so that is something that we've seen the campaign talk about. We've heard the vice president talk about, every surrogate talk about really across the country. But right now in Georgia, the campaign clearly believes that this is something that they need to elevate so the audiences there, the women and the people who support them in Georgia can see this and understand that the campaign believes that this is something they can tie Donald Trump directly to.
And as we mentioned, Harris is thinking about a visit to the border when she travels to Arizona on Friday. Does the campaign feel that it's important to tackle some of these weakest issues and go head on with these just a few weeks to go?
Yeah, so the campaign doesn't necessarily believe that the vice president's position on immigration and border security is one that is weak. Obviously, polling suggests, an NBC News poll just over the weekend pointed to Donald Trump showing greater strength on the issue of border security and controlling immigration. At the same time, the vice president has spoken about it. She has said that Donald Trump is responsible for the bill that did not make it out of Congress earlier this year. And so one source tells us that we should expect the vice president, when she goes to Arizona this week, to talk about border control, border security rather, and controlling the immigration issue. There are questions, though, at this point about whether she will actually go to the border, potentially visiting a border patrol facility in Arizona. That's something that we understand from sources is being considered by the Harris campaign at this point, but it would still be something that needs to be finalized, and logistics would have to be worked out for that to happen when the vice president goes to Arizona on Friday, Ryan.
Okay, Aaron, thank you for that update. We appreciate it. After the break, a controversial new rule approved by Trump allies in the Georgia Election Board that could delay the results of one of 2024's most crucial swing states. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Georgia is among the most crucial battleground states in this election year, but it may also be among the last states to declare a winner. That's because Georgia's election board just passed a rule requiring all ballots to be counted by hand after the polls close on election night. Critics, including the state's Republican Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, says that it could undermine voters' confidence in the election results and that the delay in reporting results could create a vacuum for misinformation. The rule passed the election board by a 3-2 vote. All 3 yeses came from board members that Donald Trump praised during a rally in Atlanta last month. Now, those are the same board members who also voted last month to give local officials new powers to investigate election results, another change that could delay or even potentially derail the certification of the results. I'm joined now by Greg Bluestein, who's the senior political reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He's also an NBC News political contributor. Greg, nobody better than you to talk about what's happening there in Atlanta. I mean, specifically, this new rule about hand counting the ballots, what does it involve, and does it pertain to just all the ballots cast or just in-person ballots?
Yeah, it pertains to the ballots cast at precincts. And the worry here is the officials wouldn't be asked to tally votes for Harris or for Trump, just an overall count. But the worry is it could add significant delays to the reporting at night. When there's already all sorts of pro-Trump election fraud conspiracies, when bigger counties like Fulton County, the biggest county and the most populous county in Georgia, and others that tend to be Democratic bastions come in later. The worry is that this would add even more delays and inject more chaos and more concerns and more questions about election results that Republicans and Democrats agree will be free and fair.
Give us an idea. How much longer could it take to count these ballots compared to previous elections?
It could be significantly longer. It could be hours longer. It could be even days longer. There's also concerns that it will inject humans into the process. Right? Opening sealed boxes could add human error and could also lead to more concerns about tampering with votes that otherwise would stay sealed unless there's a recount. So that's just part of it. But the interesting thing to me is that this isn't a Republican versus Democrat issue. This is a sort of mainstream Republicans and Democrats versus MAGA Republicans issue. You have a number of senior Republicans in Georgia raising alarms about these changes, not just Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, but others, including the former Governor Nathan Deal and others who are saying that these 11th hour changes will be a burden on local elections officials.
And you mentioned Raffensperger. He's been very critical of this new hand counting rule. You would count him among the more traditional Republicans, obviously somebody who has drawn the ire of former President Trump. Does he have the power or authority to reject this by himself, all on his own, or is he at the whim of the election board?
So his job is he oversees Georgia's elections. This is a rulemaking body that even some Republicans say is exceeding its authority, that it's illegal for them to make these sorts of changes. The state attorney general, Republican Chris Carr, recently put out a memo essentially through his office saying that this rule is, I'm quoting here, not tethered to any statute and is likely the precise kind of impermissible legislation that agencies cannot do. So you're seeing a lot of pushback from fellow Republicans on whether or not this election board can even push forward these different rule changes this close to an election. And there'll be a whole litany of legal challenges. There already are a few challenges. Expect to see a lot more.
And how quickly can the courts make a decision on this? I would assume they would have to act pretty quickly here.
They're going to have to act very quickly because early voting in Georgia starts in a few weeks, October 15th. So it's right around the corner. There are many Republicans and Democrats who say that there shouldn't be any election rule changes the year of an election, let alone less than a month before people start to vote. That's part of the issue. And that's one of the reasons, Ryan, why so many local elections boards officials are saying this is impossible. Republican and Democrats, they're worried that this adds a new burden on them. And these people are the cogs of our democracy. Mm-hmm. They're the ones working in the counties to make sure that our election results are free and fair.
Well, it's not a done deal yet. We'll have to see how the courts respond. Greg Bluestein, always good to have you on. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, Harris's cash advantage, Trump's latest comments on abortion, and why it all matters in the final stretch of the campaign. Our panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Just 6 weeks to Election Day, and there are new signs that congressional Republicans are growing frustrated by their party's nominee, specifically for a lack of help with crucial down-ballot races. Punchbowl News reports that former President Trump has yet to appear at a major fundraising event for House Republicans or their campaign arm, despite lobbying from the group's chair, Richard Hudson. The RNC has also not given any money to the group. It comes as Mr. Trump has struggled with fundraising himself, trailing Harris in cash on hand by about $100 million. This according to August FEC filings. Joining me now on set is Melanie Zanona, a senior congressional reporter for Punchbowl News and a brand new NBC News contributor. Simone Sanders Townsend, former senior advisor to Vice President Harris and a co-host of The Weekend, which is weekends on MSNBC, and Republican strategist Brad Todd. And we should point out this is Mel's first day at the Meet the Press table.
So Mel, she didn't bring coffee.
She didn't bring coffee.
She did not tell me that.
No one told her about that. But we're excited to have you as an NBC News contributor, and thank you for being here. And of course, you come to the table with some reporting, some great reporting from Punchbowl News about this dynamic playing out between the nominee, Donald Trump, and House Republicans. Obviously, a razor-thin margin in the House of Representatives. He's going to need these guys if he gets elected, but it doesn't seem as though he's offering much financial help right now.
No, and this has become an increasing source of tension in the House Republican Conference. They are struggling right now with fundraising. The NRCC, which is the House GOP campaign arm, is getting trounced by the Democratic campaign arm, and they were really counting on Trump to headline a fundraiser or a dinner for them, because in the past, he has done their spring dinner, and it's been one of the highest grossing events that the NRCC typically does all years. I mean, we're talking 8 figures here. So they were really budgeting for something like that. And he wasn't able to go this year because he had his court schedule in April because of his New York hush money trial. So since then, Republicans have been privately lobbying Trump, really trying to get him to commit to something. They've said, yeah, we'll do something, but there's nothing on the books. Now there's only, 40 days or so into the election. And so they are starting to panic in the House Republican leadership about getting this done.
And they are running out of time. I mean, the most he's done right now is he held an event on Long Island. There's a lot of embattled Long Island Republicans. I mean, do they view that as the kind of help they need, or do they need the cold hard cash?
They need the money, right? All of it helps. And if you talk to Trump's camp, they'll say, well, he's helping them in other ways, right? He's going out to some of these districts. You'll see some of these members use Trump in their own fundraising appeals, but it is not the same. The NRCC, the RNC has not transferred any money to the NRCC. Trump has not transferred any money to the NRCC. And meanwhile, Kamala Harris, just for context here, she just transferred $10 million over to the D-Trip, which is the Democratic House campaign arm. So you get the sense of just how different they are right now.
Brad, I assume down-ballot candidates always want more money.
Well, it's really it's an institutional question. The NRCC and the DCCC need to be at parity. And one thing that's unique about the House is members of Congress transfer money from their own campaigns into the NRCC and DCCC. So these Republican congressmen who have had Trump's back when he was president in the House, who are doing the combat on the oversight committees, defending his administration, they're putting their campaign money into the NRCC in the effort to hold this slim 6-seat majority. So he needs to do it too. It's expected. It's expected, and they'll remember in the next administration if he doesn't.
So, Simone, I want to put up our most recent cash-on-hand numbers for the presidential campaigns. And could it be that Donald Trump isn't giving to these down-ballot candidates because he needs the money himself? I mean, he is facing a $100 million deficit right now in terms of cash on hand. The money is not flowing in like it once was. Is this an issue of Trump just needs the money on his own and he really can't help anyone else?
Perhaps he does need the money on his own, but to be very clear, I mean, we often talk a lot about it in the context of Vice President Harris's campaign and that, she could win, but she needs a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. To be very clear, if the Republican candidate for president, who's Donald Trump in this case, he will need a Republican House and a Republican Senate. Speaker Hakeem Jeffries, I don't think is pushing forward any of the Project 2025 agenda or Agenda 47, whatever we'd like to call it today. And so when you are running in a presidential election cycle where every year House members have, every 2 years House members are on the ballot, but in a cycle where the Senate is on the line as well, Democrats specifically are defending 22. You would say 23, but I'm not counting West Virginia. So 22 seats in the Senate.
You're conceding one already.
Well, I'm just saying, I'm a realist. I'm a pragmatic, I'm a pragmatic progressive.
Concede Montana too.
Well, no, because the Secretary of State is doing some interesting things, but this is, to this point, candidates need money. And so, yes, fundraising appeals is really important, but and being able to use Trump's likeness and Trump showing up or Vice President Harris showing up in a district for a candidate is really important. But you need money to put ads on television. And when the history is looked at, when the history is written about this particular election cycle, it is going to be one of the most expensive in our country's history.
All right, well, let's talk about the message that both sides are sending out to their constituents right now. And Donald Trump, he's had a difficult time talking about abortion. It's not an easy topic for Republicans, given the mood of the country right now. But he has seemed to have settled on somewhat of a message when it comes to women and abortion. Take a listen to what he said yesterday.
Women will be happy, healthy, confident and free. You will no longer be thinking about abortion. So all they talk about abortion because we've done something that nobody else could have done. It is now where it always had to be, with the states. I will protect women at a level never seen before. They will finally be healthy, hopeful, safe, and secure. Their lives will be happy, beautiful, and great.
Interestingly, he did seem to be reading that off the teleprompter. This wasn't something he just seemed to be vamping. But Brad, I want to ask you about this. Donald Trump has a serious gender gap problem. Our latest NBC News poll shows a 21-point advantage with women for Kamala Harris. Before you go there, obviously, on the other side of the spectrum, Trump has a tremendous advantage when it comes to men. But let's specifically talk about women right now. Is this kind of rhetoric that's going to help him close that gap with women?
Well, I think, first off, it's an insult to women to say that the only issue they care about is abortion. They don't care about prices. They don't care about crime. They don't care about the larger economy. And that's what he's trying to get there. And of course, in some polls, the gender gap is about equal. You know, Trump will lead with men by about as many as Harris leads with women. That's why you see her talking about, if you break in my house, I'll shoot you. She's trying to do everything she can to help herself with men. He's trying to do some things to help himself with women. And I think prices, health care, that top crime, those are good things for him to talk about.
But we've seen, Mel, with these down-ballot candidates as well, how they've tried to wrestle with the issue of abortion. Ohio is a perfect example. The Senate candidate there, Bernie Moreno, called women single-issue voters on abortion. He said it doesn't matter for women over the age of 50. I mean, that's a red state. It voted to enshrine a right to abortion by 10 points last year. I mean, how are Republicans wrestling with this up and down the ballot?
If you're Sherrod Brown, you're just going to be running that on replay, right, as an ad. Listen, Republicans, after the 2022 election, they walked away from that and said, we have a problem on abortion. It's a messaging problem. But it has become clear that it is more than just a messaging problem. It's a substance issue, right? And Republicans have still not figured out how to talk about it because their policies are in direct conflict with what is popular, in the country right now. They say Trump has taken credit for overturning Roe v. Wade. That turned it to the states. But now the states have been responsible for instituting these abortion bans, which are deeply unpopular. So they just are wrestling with how to talk about it. Now, we have seen some of them go on offense a little bit in terms of putting out some ads saying, here's what we do stand for. We do support IVF. We support mothers and families. But it is simply not enough to overcome what is happening on the ground in these states.
And Simone, I'm going to give you the last word on this, and we don't have a lot of time. But to Brad's point, when Trump talks about the economy, Kamala Harris responds with abortion. Is that the way out of this, or does she also have to address the economy specifically and not just use abortion as her way out of every argument?
Well, I think I think it's important to realize that abortion is an economic issue for people all across this country. The ability to be able to make a decision about what your family looks like and when you have children as a woman in this country, we're the people that have to take off work, to be very clear, when you birth a child. But I do think that the Harris campaign and the vice president has given extensive proposals. People can debate the details of the proposals, but about our economic policy. Donald Trump, child care is one of the biggest bills for families in this country. And on one of the biggest bills, something that families across the board are struggling with, from rural America to suburban America to the cities, he doesn't seem to understand it. So that, to me, is a big issue. But abortion, this is a problem for Republicans because they have not walked away from the policy.
Okay. All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Mel, maybe we'll have you back. She did okay.
I'll bring donuts next time.
All right, thank you so much. Mel, Simone, and Brad, thank you all for being here. Still to come, meet the Delaware state lawmaker who could soon make history in Congress. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Delaware Democratic Senator Tom Carper's retirement seems likely to trigger some history on Capitol Hill. Delaware Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester is favored to become the state's next senator and would be the first woman and the first person of color to represent Delaware in the Senate. And the candidate likely to replace her as Delaware's at-large representative in Congress is Democratic State Senator Sarah McBride, who won her primary earlier this month and is on course to become the first transgender member of Congress. And joining me now is Delaware State Senator and Democratic House candidate Sarah McBride. Senator, thank you so much for being here. Here in D.C., we're about 6 days away from a government shutdown. This is one of several times that Congress has struggled to keep the lights on and avoid a credit default. Congress hasn't really done much lawmaking in the last year or so. Why do you want to come here and be a part of this?
Well, I think the developments this week with the Democratic caucus likely having to come in to save the day has really reinforced why we need a Democratic House come January 2025. I mean, we have to remember that when the Democrats had control of the House with a similar margin to what Republicans currently have right now, they passed the largest investment in infrastructure since the 1950s, the largest expansion of veterans benefits since the GI Bill, the first gun safety package since the 1990s, the largest expansion of healthcare since the ACA, and the biggest step to combat climate change of any nation on earth ever. And so we have before us a clear choice between returning to the incompetence and the chaos of the Trump years, or turning the page on the politics of the past and helping to move this country forward by delivering for people. But we have to send people to Washington who have a proven track record of rolling up their sleeves, diving into the details, bringing people together. That's what I've done here in Delaware, passing paid family and medical leave, expanding access to health care. That's what I'll do in Congress.
So you obviously are from Delaware, so you've been represented by Joe Biden in one way, shape, or form for basically your entire life. Have you gotten an idea after watching the president and now watching the Harris campaign, how do you think that Vice President Harris would be different as a president than what you've seen from Joe Biden?
Well, look, I think every single candidate is their own person. And when Joe Biden made the historically selfless decision, patriotic decision, to pass the baton to a new generation of Americans, he helped to re-energize the Democratic Party. He helped to renew and reinstill joy and hope in our politics. And I think, look, Kamala Harris represents a new generation of leadership. I think she understands the issues that we are facing as a country. She understands the issues that younger people and younger workers are facing. She'll be her own kind of leader. But of course, she'll also be a leader that builds on the progress of the Biden-Harris administration, progress that I just articulated. But we got to make sure that we send her a Democratic Congress and a Democratic Senate so that she can implement her policies that will bring down costs facing families, that'll protect reproductive freedom in this country, that'll help create an economy that works for everyone, including small businesses. And that's one of the reasons I'm so eager to win this race, but also help elect Democrats across this country so that President Harris can have a Democratic Congress that allows her to build on the progress of the last 4 years.
So if you and Kamala Harris are both elected, you would be one of the votes that she would depend on when it comes to passing her agenda, because under any circumstances, it will probably be tight margins in the House of Representatives. One of her more controversial plans is to raise the corporate tax rate, as well as instituting a tax on unrealized capital gains for the highest earners. You come from a state with a lot of headquarters of some major corporations like Delaware. Is this something you can support?
Look, I think that, like President Biden, Vice President Harris is putting forward a plan that empowers working people and their families. We know that the only way to grow America's economy is from the middle out, not the top down. It's one of the reasons why I'm so supportive of policies like paid family and medical leave, policies that'll expand access to child care and invest in affordable housing. But we, of course, have to pay for that. And I believe that we can deliver for working people, enhance our economy without raising taxes on people making under $400,000 a year. And that can be through guaranteeing that corporations and the wealthy are paying their fair share. I think Delawareans of every economic background support those types of common sense solutions. Policies that are paid for by guaranteeing that everyone's paying their fair share and lifting up families and workers in the process.
All right, I want to play for you now an ad that the Trump campaign is currently using in some of their ad campaigns across the country. Take a listen.
Even the liberal media was shocked Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners and illegal aliens.
Every transgender inmate would have access.
Kamala's for they, them. President Trump is for you.
It seems as though Trump is essentially saying that Vice President Harris is for trans individuals like yourself, and he is not. If he wins, how would you be able to work with his administration?
Well, first off, I think Kamala Harris is for every American. I think she sees and respects all of us, and I think she will have an administration that seeks to deliver for all of us. I think one of the problems in our politics right now is that too often politicians seek to ignore the problems of those who don't vote for them or even make those problems worse. Kamala Harris, unlike Donald Trump, will bring people together, bring out the best of our country, and adopt policies that seek to uplift everyone, regardless of your background or your identity. Look, I'm used to working with people who disagree with me on pretty fundamental issues, including issues that are near and dear to my own heart. I'm not running to be the transgender member of Congress. I'm running to be Delaware's member of Congress, working on all of the issues that matter. And that means working with people who disagree with me on some deeply personal issues. That's what I've done here in Delaware, where nearly every bill that I have introduced and passed in the General Assembly, I have passed with bipartisan support from people who don't vote the same way I do on LGBTQ equality. I'd operate the same in Congress.
All right. Well, State Senator Sarah McBride, you still got quite a bit of campaign left. We wish you the best of luck, and perhaps we'll see you here in Washington in January. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. But the news continues with Tom Costello, who is in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.